Welcome to Elle's Books and Curiosities. Today, we're going to talk about a fantasy book, which was a New York Times best-selling novel. So let's talk about A House of Salt and Sorrows by Erin A. Craig. So let me start by telling you something. In the past, never, ever, under any circumstances, do I review books that I do not like. If you look on my Goodreads or my Amazon reviews or anything like that, 4 stars, 5 stars only. If I didn't like a book, I just don't talk about it because I appreciate that author's work. And the last thing I'm going to do is jump on to a review, leave 3 stars or less with like an unkind review, because just because it's not my cup of tea, that's no reason for me to I don't know, say anything unkind to this author that put so much time and effort into this book. However, I do want to do things differently on my vlog, just for the purpose of breaking down the creative writing process, talking about what works and what doesn't work. So I want to talk to you about a book that I read that I personally don't think works, and I want to explain why, right? First, let's get into the atmosphere, which in my opinion is one of the only elements that is really, really successful in this book. It takes place in another world. Also, side comment, I was surprised there wasn't a map in this fantasy world. Not that that's a standard or anything, but I feel like most fantasy readers appreciate a map of, so they can orient themselves to this new world they're experiencing for the first time. The atmosphere is the strongest aspect of this book. The majority of the book takes place in a manor called Highmore. It has a very oceanic / Victorian atmosphere to it. It's on this, high-rise cliffs overlooking the sea. There's a lot of gorgeous dresses, candlelight. It has this very rich, deep Gothic Victorian vibe. And to me, this was the strongest element. I loved it. I loved the description. I could just see everything. I could feel this place. Oh, just a really, really gorgeous atmosphere that this author created for this story. If anything, I would call it a fantasy hybrid, a fantasy Gothic hybrid that the author created for this tale. So let's kind of get into the story. Essentially, Craig took the 12 Dancing Princesses, I believe that's what it's called. It's a Grimm's fairy tale. And she put her own spin on it, right? And kind of crafted this world around it by her own construction. But here's the problem. When you're world building, and this is one of the elements that failed for me in this book, it needs to feel like this world has existed for hundreds and hundreds of years, and it's layered and real, and the reader is now just being dropped into a place that has existed forever, since its inception, right? I feel like there was a huge missed opportunity in this book, because I feel like the author eventually tells the reader that gods and people live very closely together. So if you saw a god at a party, it wouldn't be a big deal. But this element was introduced a little bit later in the story and a little hastily, in my opinion. So that element wasn't very established. I was very confused halfway through, towards the end of the book, about the gods of this world, their intentions, the people's beliefs and motivations weren't clearly outlined. So that all felt very muddled to me. So essentially, the story, like I said, is based on the 12 Dancing Princesses, and the main characters, Elle and her sisters, there's a lot of sisters, each one keeps dying these morbid deaths. You're kind of wondering well, are they cursed and what's happening? Meanwhile, Elle and her sisters are sneaking off to these very magical balls. And again, the atmosphere is beautiful, absolutely gorgeous. The balls, the dresses, the slippers, these beautiful halls that are created for these scenes. I mean, just very real. The atmosphere it's beautiful. It's beautiful to read these places that the author created to set the scene for these balls and to have the girls in Highmore. But what it's missing is the roots and the foundation of this world. So like, yes, we're dropped into this like gorgeous Victorian atmosphere that's beautifully gothic and has these whimsical elements of fantasy. But because the foundation of the world building is shaky, the story suffers for it because it's just not effective. Like, it's unclear. So many things are unclear, which is unfortunate because the atmosphere is really lovely. Now, I sympathize with this author big time because she tried to write 12 young women that varied in ages from like 4 to 16 or 17. Here's the thing. I couldn't tell the difference between any of the girls at Highmore. Even the main character, she didn't like stand out to me. And I had the same problem with the men. All the men kind of blended together. They didn't seem separate. Again, it's like really challenging. I think dialogue and characterization is one of like the hardest parts of writing, honestly. But something that I often think about, and I know it's not a book, but something I often think about as a great example of characterization. If you took Iron Man, Thor, and Captain America, right? I mean, think about Endgame or Infinity War, any of those movies, they started off as screenplays. If you read a section of the film as like, you know, a screenplay, and you took away the dialogue tags, I guarantee you would know which character was speaking, because you would see the ego of Tony Stark. You would hear like a little bit of like Asgardian phrasing from Thor, and you would get that good old boy, like virtuous values first from Captain America. You don't need to know who's saying it to know who's saying it, which to me is like the greatest skill of a writer that's illustrating characters, that each one is different, separate. I mean, just think about people. Nobody speaks the same. No one has the same mannerisms or gestures or inflections in their voice. All of those elements that make people real and make characters real on the big screen, that has to be present in a book. I need to know the difference between all these people. And unfortunately, again, that was a huge element missing from this book. I didn't know the difference between the girls or who was speaking, or, you know, the men weren't really different, or they all kind of acted and spoke the same way. The ending, which again, unfortunately, was another missed opportunity in my opinion. So like I said, the author set this story up to surround a world that lived side by side very closely with gods, like kind of, you know, like a Zeus, like they would drop in, maybe be human for a second and like do something with a human. And so like that's kind of the intention. It wasn't very clear. So we get kind of to like the end of the book, the world building wasn't there. So when you get to the end and you find out that all of the horrible deaths, spoiler alert, spoiler, by the way, spoiler, all the horrible deaths are happening because one of the gods made a deal with Annale's stepmother, right? And the god himself was like super cool. Like I wish he had made an appearance earlier on, or she had like utilized him more, because he was like actually pretty badass when he finally showed up. But another confusing aspect to me was that god used another god to do his dirty work of like tormenting these girls and like harming them and stuff, which again, the world building wasn't there. Why do these gods want to do this? Why does this god that made the deal need another god to like do a bunch of fucked up shit to these girls? Like the intention, the culture, the beliefs, the like years that this world has existed was missing. So when we get to the end, that moment with the gods was not powerful to me, because I don't know anything about these gods. I don't understand what they want. At that point, I just don't understand. There's not motivation. There's not an investment in this world. You know what I mean? I know it sounds like I'm just like trashing this book, but I'm not. I just want to express like how important these elements are to a story. And that's why I break down my reviews into the atmosphere, the story, the characters, and the ending. One can't exist without the other. I mean, each one is like the leg of a table. If you don't have one, it's just not going to be successful. The atmosphere was there big time for me, and this author has a great strength in that. I think the world building aspect kind of affected the story, and then it affected the ending. Maybe just the world building needed to be worked on a little bit so that like we really understood the motivation of these gods and why they did what they did. I know it was a New York Times bestseller, and I know that my opinion might not be the common one or the popular one, but I don't know. I couldn't help it. I mean, I feel so strongly about characterization and world building in a story. So like when I feel like it's missing, it just kind of, I don't know, it affects the whole experience for me. But read the book, see what you think. Maybe you'll agree with me, maybe not. There are a lot of strong reviews on it. There are also a lot of reviews that mirrored my impressions. So I guess it's just a reader's choice. Here's a random thought, and I'm going to tell you something about myself that's probably one of like the geekiest, nerdiest things about me. When I hear the word pocket in any context, it doesn't matter who's saying it, it doesn't matter what the situation is, like, hey, where are my keys? They're in my pocket. Or, you know, oh, look, I found $1 in my pocket. It doesn't matter like what the situation is. If I hear the word pocket, in my head, I think, what's he got in his pockets? His hobbit. But it's in the voice of Gollum in my head. So no matter what happens, whoever's saying pocket in my head, I say, what's he got in his pockets? His hobbits. Hobbits is
potatoes.
Second breakfast all the way. I'm sorry. Dude, come on. It's Tolkien. Like, come on. Any fantasy lover is a Tolkien fan. Argue with me. You've read C.S. Lewis. You've read Tolkien. You've probably also read Dune, which I haven't read. I know that's terrible, but it's like super intimidating. The book's like bigger than the Bible. Like, I'm gonna read it. I'm gonna read it. I am. But what's he got in his pockets, his hobbit?